Okay, so are you ready to dive into a fascinating period of Chinese history with me today?
I am. I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. It's one that's always captivated me, full of iconic figures, major battles, and political intrigue.
It's amazing how much it still influences culture today, even globally, right?
Absolutely. It's incredible to see its reach. But before we jump into the thick of it, I think it's important to set the stage. We're talking about the Three Kingdoms period here.
Right, and that means we got to rewind a bit first, back to the fall of the Han Dynasty.
The Han Dynasty ruling for centuries and then, boom, chaos. Was it really that sudden, though?
Well, not exactly. Think of it more like a slow decline. Corruption, infighting, all these things chipping away at their power.
And eventually it created this power vacuum, right? That's when things get really interesting.
Exactly. Opportunistic leaders, always waiting for a chance to grab power. It's a tale as old as time, don't you think?
It really is. And our sources paint a pretty dramatic picture of this time, starting with the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 AD.
Ah, the Yellow Turbans. A fascinating movement. More than just rebels, they were driven by this idea of a new era, a yellow sky rising.
So it wasn't just a minor uprising.
No, not at all. This was a full-blown peasant revolt, fueled by natural disasters, dissatisfaction with the ruling class. Imagine the turmoil.
Wow, and their slogan, the gray sky has perished, the yellow sky will soon rise. That's powerful imagery.
It is. It captures the essence of what they were fighting for. They even wore yellow scarves, to symbolize this new era.
A bold visual statement. But even though they ultimately failed, they really shook things up.
Absolutely. They left the Han Dynasty incredibly weak, which paved the way for, well, you guessed it, those ambitious warlords we talked about.
And from this chaos emerged figures like Dong Zhuo, seizing control of the imperial court, and the brilliant strategist Cao Cao, a name we'll be hearing a lot.
Oh, definitely. Cao Cao's a major player in this whole saga. And we can't forget Yuan Shao, another powerful warlord vying for control.
And of course, Liu Bei, who would eventually found the Shu Han kingdom, right? It's amazing to think they were all navigating this tumultuous landscape.
Imagine the political maneuvering, the constantly shifting alliances, the betrayals. It's no wonder this period has captivated storytellers for centuries.
It's like something out of a movie. Actually, it's more captivating than a movie because it really happened.
Yeah, and we're just getting started. Oh, yeah, from all that chaos, those power struggles you were just talking about, three major forces emerged, kind of rose to the top.
Okay, so these are our three kingdoms then, right? Cao Wei, Shu Han, and Eastern Wu. Sounds like the start of a epic fantasy novel.
Right. Each with their own distinct characteristics, their own ways of trying to survive and thrive in this chaotic period. It really was like watching the map of China get completely redrawn.
Okay, so let's break it down. We've got Cao Wei in the north. What made them stand out?
Well, they actually inherited a lot from the Han Dynasty. I think resources, infrastructure, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Cao Pi, who was Cao Cao's son, he's the one who officially established the kingdom.
Okay, so they were starting off with a bit of a head start, at least materially.
Right, and they really leaned into that. They were known for being very practical, strong militarily, and they also had some really innovative policies, especially when it came to things like agriculture.
Interesting. So they were the pragmatists of the bunch, focused on building a strong foundation. What about Shu Han over in the west? They were led by Liu Bei, right?
That's right. They were kind of the underdog in this whole thing, which is probably why they're often romanticized, even today.
Yeah.
They had this naturally defensible area, the Sichuan Basin.
Ah, so geography was on their side.
It definitely helped.
Mm-hmm.
But they also had strong leadership, first with Liu Bei, of course, and then later with his super strategist, Zhu Jiliang.
Zhu Liang, yeah, his name keeps popping up. We're definitely going to have to circle back to him. But first, we got to complete our three kingdoms picture. We've got Cao Wei in the north, Shu Han in the west. That leaves Eastern Wu in the south. What was their deal?
They were all about that water, my friend. They controlled the Yangtze River and a lot of the surrounding waterways, which made them formidable when it came to naval warfare.
Ah, so while the others focused on land, they took to the seas. That makes sense.
Exactly. And they were clever about it. They built up this impressive maritime trade network, proving they weren't just good at fighting on water, they knew how to use it to their advantage economically, too.
So we've got our three kingdoms, each with their own territory, their own strengths, their own leaders. But this wasn't just some game of risk, right? There were real people caught in the middle of all this. What was life like for everyday people during this time?
That's a really important question. It's easy to get caught up in the battles and the political maneuvering, but the human cost of this period was huge. Warfare, obviously, but also things like famine and disease. It all took a toll.
It sounds pretty bleak, honestly.
It wasn't easy for a lot of people. And remember, these weren't just battles for land or resources. They were also about legitimacy. Each kingdom believed they had what was called the mandate of heaven.
The mandate of heaven. Can you explain what that is exactly? I think some people might not be familiar with that concept.
Yeah, so in a lot of cultures, there's this idea that rulers are like divinely appointed. In ancient China, this divine approval, this right to rule, was called the mandate of heaven. So it wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about being chosen by a higher power.
Okay, so the stakes were even higher than we thought. These kingdoms weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for a divine blessing, no pressure.
Exactly. It added this whole other layer to the conflict, made it much more than just a grab for power.
So, amidst all this talk of battles and divine mandates, did anything good come out of this period? Were there any advancements or innovations?
Oh, absolutely. You know what they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Right.
And there was a lot of necessity during the Three Kingdoms.
So, people had to get creative to solve problems. I bet that led to some interesting developments.
It did. Take Xi Jiang, for example. We were talking about him earlier, right?
Hmm.
Brilliant strategist, military mind, but he was also a bit of an inventor. He realized that to win wars, you got to master logistics, moving troops and supplies effectively.
Makes sense. An army marches on its stomach, as they say.
Exactly. So Zhu Jilang, he's credited with inventing the wooden ox, which was essentially an early type of wheelbarrow.
Wow, so even in the midst of all that conflict, you had people like Zhu Liang making advancements that had a real impact.
Exactly. And it wasn't just him. Remember Eastern Wu and their whole naval dominance? Well, they made some pretty significant advances in shipbuilding and navigation too, which obviously played a part in their success on the water.
So even in these chaotic times, there's progress happening. It's a good reminder that history is never just one thing. But speaking of history and those epic clashes we talked about earlier, I think it's time we delve into one of the most iconic battles of this entire period, the Battle of Red Cliffs.
Oh yeah, now that is a story and a half. It's legendary, even today, and considered one of those famous naval battles in Chinese history.
So set the scene for us. What led to this epic showdown, and who are the major players involved?
Picture this. It's the year 208 AD. Cao Cao, he's at the height of his power, feeling pretty unstoppable. He decides to march south with a massive army.
Ambitious. What was his goal? Total domination.
Pretty much. He wanted to crush his rivals, Sun Quan of Eastern Wu and Liu Bei of Shuhan, and finally unify China under his rule.
So it was the pragmatist, Cao Cao, versus, well, what would you even call the alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei? Were they the idealists in this scenario?
Yeah, you could say that. They were definitely fighting to preserve their own vision, their independence. Cao Cao was all about strength and unification, a very pragmatic approach. But Sun Quan and Liu Bei, they were driven by something else. They were fighting for a different kind of future.
And that clash of ideologies, that fight for a different kind of future, it all came to a head at this epic battle on the water.
It did. And let me tell you, the odds were not in Sun Quan and Liu Bei's favor. They were totally outnumbered by Cao Cao's forces.
So how did they pull off a win?
A combination of factors, really. They had brilliant strategists on their side, Zhu Yu especially, who was instrumental in planning the naval maneuvers. But they also used the environment to their advantage, employing some pretty clever and devastating fire attacks.
Fire attacks on water? How does that even...
They used, like, fire ships, basically setting them ablaze and sailing them towards Cao Cao's fleet. Can you imagine hundreds of ships going up in flames in the Yangtze River? It must have been a chaotic, terrifying scene.
That's insane. It sounds like something out of a movie, but even more intense.
It was a decisive victory for Sun Quan and Liu Bei. Cao Cao and his forces, they were completely routed, forced to retreat in humiliation. The Battle of Red Cliffs, it wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point in the Three Kingdoms period.
Wow, so even though they were the underdogs, they managed to completely turn the tables on Cao Cao.
They did. And that victory, it had huge implications. It basically guaranteed that the Three Kingdoms they would endure. It cemented the existence of Shuhan, it solidified Eastern Wu's power, and it kept Cao Cao's ambitions of swift unification firmly in check. But, and this is the thing about the Three Kingdoms, one victory never meant the end of the story.
Oh, I bet. This is just the beginning, right? What happened next? So much for happily ever after, right? I can't imagine things just settled down after that epic battle.
You'd be right about that. The Battle of Red Cliffs was a turning point, for sure. but it didn't exactly usher in an era of peace and harmony. The struggle for power was far from over. In fact, things were just heating up.
Oh, I bet. So what happened next? More battles? Shifting alliances?
All of the above. It was a constant back and forth for decades. Campaigns were launched, alliances were forged and broken, and through it all, you had figures like Zhuge Liang trying to navigate this complex web of power.
Suge Liang, our strategic mastermind. We talked about his brilliance earlier. What role did he play in the events that unfolded after Red Cliffs?
Well, after the Battle of Red Cliffs, Zhuge Liang, he became like the key strategist for Shuhan. Remember, they were still kind of the underdogs in all this, right?
Right. Despite their victory at Red Cliffs, they were still facing pressure from the north, from Cao Cao.
Exactly. So Zhuge Liang, he knew that Shuhan, they needed to strengthen their position if they wanted to survive. So he launched a series of campaigns known as the Northern Expeditions.
The Northern Expeditions. What were those all about? Was he trying to conquer Cao Cao?
It was more about weakening them, really. Trying to gain some strategic advantages, secure some territory, tip the balance of power a bit more in Shuhan's favor. He knew that taking down Cao Cao completely, that was a long shot. But he could at least try to make them less of a threat.
And how successful were these Northern Expeditions?
Well, that's where things get tricky. Zhuge Liang, he was a brilliant strategist, like seriously, a genius when it came to military tactics and logistics.
We talked about his invention, the wooden ox.
Exactly. That's just one example. He was always innovating, always thinking several steps ahead. But even with all his brilliance, he faced some serious obstacles.
Like what kind of obstacles are we talking about?
Well, for starters, the terrain up north where he was campaigning, it wasn't exactly ideal. Think mountains, rivers, difficult supply lines.
Yeah.
It was tough going. And then, of course, there was Cao Cao. They weren't just going to roll over.
So even Zhuge Liang's genius couldn't overcome everything.
It's true. He had some victories, some impressive ones, but he also suffered setbacks. The Northern Expeditions, they were this constant struggle, a testament to his strategic mind, but also a reminder that even the best laid plans don't always work out.
So what happened? Did he ultimately succeed in securing Shuhan's position?
Unfortunately, no. Zhuge Liang, he died in 234 AD while on campaign.
Oh, wow. That must have been a huge blow to Shuhan.
It was. He was more than just a strategist. He was a symbol of their resilience, their hope. Without him, Shuhan, they were significantly weakened. They continued to fight on for a while, but they never really recovered from his loss.
So what became of the three kingdoms? Did any of them manage to achieve lasting dominance?
Well, not really. It's kind of a bittersweet ending, honestly. Shuhan, weakened after Zhuge Liang's death, they eventually fell to a Wei invasion in 263 AD. Eastern Wu, they held on a bit longer, but they were dealing with their own internal struggles, and the pressure from the north, it never really let up. Finally, in 279 AD, they too were conquered. The Jin dynasty, which had replaced Cao Wei in the north, they managed to unify China once again.
So after all that, after decades of division and conflict, China was whole again. It's kind of a cyclical thing, isn't it? Empires rise, empires fall.
That's history for you. But here's the thing about the Three Kingdoms period.
Yeah.
Even though it was ultimately a story of conflict and decline, it left behind an incredible legacy. We've talked about the battles, the strategizing, but we can't forget the cultural impact.
Right. The stories that emerged from this period, they've had a lasting impact on Chinese culture and beyond.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Operas, plays, novels, video games. The Three Kingdoms period is everywhere. It's this epic saga full of larger-than-life figures, political intrigue, and these timeless themes of loyalty, betrayal, ambition. It's no wonder it continues to fascinate people even today.
It's amazing how a period in history that only lasted for, like 60 years or so, can have such a profound and lasting impact.
It goes to show you the power of a good story, right?
Okay.
The Three Kingdoms period, it's a reminder that history, it's more than just dates and names in a textbook. It's about real people, their choices, their struggles, their triumphs. And sometimes it's those stories, those human dramas that have the most enduring power.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, wouldn't you say? We've journeyed through the Three Kingdoms period, explored its epic battles and political intrigue, and we've seen how those events continue to resonate even today. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past, especially when it's filled with such compelling stories.